You've worked on podcasts, have a podcast, or have thought about starting your own podcast, we have a great program for you today. We're going to tell you about the new SAG-AFTRA podcast agreements, our new simplified signing process, and some of the benefits of working under a SAG-AFTRA podcast agreement. Hello and welcome. I'm SAG-AFTRA Executive Vice President Ben Whitehair. Thank you all for joining us for yet another SAG-AFTRA program on YouTube. We are joined today by American Sign Language interpreters Darcy French Meyerson and Marra Bassani Santa Maria. Podcasts have come a long way in the last decade. What started as a niche medium with a tiny audience has become an entertainment juggernaut with millions of listeners, hours of great audio entertainment, and billions of dollars in annual revenue. Most of these podcasts are produced by small media companies or independently by individuals, which makes them excellent candidates for one of SAG-AFTRA's new podcast agreements. So, how is SAG-AFTRA approaching coverage of this wide world of podcasts? I'm so glad you asked. We have invited SAG-AFTRA National Director of Contract Strategic Initiatives and Podcasts, Sue-Ann Morrow, to explain our new podcast contracts, how to sign your podcast, and the benefits that these agreements have to offer. Sue-Ann Morrow is National Director of SAG-AFTRA's podcast department and spearheaded the establishment of new dedicated podcast agreements and a streamlined signatory process that allows podcasters and podcast producers to easily cover their podcasts under a SAG-AFTRA contract. She is also National Director of SAG-AFTRA's Department of Contract Strategic Initiatives, which identifies and engages with opportunities and challenges that arise from developments in the entertainment and advertising industries, particularly those driven by new technologies and platforms. That is a lot. Sue-Ann, we are so excited to have you. In the midst of all of that, we're glad that you made the time to help all of us here as members and those watching get a better understanding of these new agreements. So take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben. Podcasts, as Ben said, are exploding. Everybody knows this. They're a form of entertainment themselves, and they are also being used as an incubator for other entertainment projects that are more traditional in nature, such as television and film. In an effort to be responsive to the needs of both our members working in this space and the employers who want to work with them, some months ago, we set about to streamline our approach to podcast coverage, to make it more relevant to this very specific corner of the entertainment and media industries, and also easier to navigate. Next slide. So, what are podcasts? Podcasts are audio-first productions that you can download or stream from a variety of podcast platforms. And the numbers vary, but depending on the source, over 100 million Americans have listened to a podcast. Over 60% of Americans have listened to a podcast, and over 30% of Americans have listened to a podcast in just the last month. What types of podcasts does SAG-AFTRA cover? Well, any podcast can be covered under a SAG-AFTRA agreement. Low budget, big budget, dramatic, interview, true crime, comedy, game show, documentary, self-produced, news, any and every podcast can be a SAG-AFTRA podcast. Next slide. SAG-AFTRA has always covered podcasts, primarily through our new media department, but those contracts were based on other contracts that were meant for audiovisual content, as was the signatory process. And we realized that we needed input from podcast performers and hosts and producers to create more relevant contracts and an easier signing process. And so the board, the National Board of the Union, established a podcast steering committee made up of members from all over the country who work in podcasts at all levels and who provided their perspective and experience and weighed in as we built new dedicated podcast agreements and this new signing process. So now we have these new dedicated agreements with terms that are relevant to the fast-moving audio-only space, which is enormously important. We have a dedicated podcast department that handles only podcasts, and we have a simplified signatory process. We have a new dedicated webpage at sagaftra.org/podcast contracts. You'll be hearing more about that later. And we have an automated signatory portal that allows producers, both large podcasting companies and individual podcasters, to sign their podcasts of all shapes and sizes swiftly and easily with lots of hands-on staff support. Next slide. So why should a member want to be sure to be covered under a podcast agreement, under a SAG-AFTRA podcast agreement? The most important part, I think, is the protection. You know that you will be safe from unauthorized or unpaid use. If you're being hired to appear in a podcast, having a union contract with your employer means that you can be secure in the knowledge that the union has your back and will enforce the terms of your agreement, including terms against unauthorized use or the creation by your employer of digital doubles from your voice through AI technology without your consent. There's language about that in our independent podcast agreement. The benefits. Your covered earnings will count towards your eligibility for health insurance and retirement benefits. Your podcasting work covered under our independent podcast agreement can help you to qualify for benefits, and it can also help add to your pension, which is awesome. Global Rule 1, as a SAG-AFTRA member, you know that you should always be covered under a SAG-AFTRA contract when you're creating content in front of a camera or behind a microphone. And our new podcast agreements make it easy to be sure you're always in good standing with your union. And finally, guidance. You'll have staff support every step of the way. We are very focused on the needs of podcasters and podcast producers, and we really are here to help. We're very excited to help you with your podcast. Next slide. So there are two ways of being covered under a SAG-AFTRA contract when you work on a podcast. You can be hired by an employer who is a signatory to one of our SAG-AFTRA podcast agreements, or you can cover your own podcast by becoming a signatory. And there are two different kinds of podcast contracts. And now it's going to get a little thicker. We're going to talk about those two kinds of podcast contracts. Next slide. Our micro-monetized podcast agreement, or our micropod, as we call it internally, covers podcasts of any genre whose budget and or monetization are less than $10,000 per podcast season per year. So that's in the aggregate. You've got your budget, and then you've got the monetization of the podcast. If you put those together and you've got less than $10,000, this is a great option for you. This is a per podcast season contract. So every new season has to be re-signed. And if you have the kind of podcast that is kind of generating weekly, monthly, daily, and it doesn't have a set season, a season for us is maximum 1 year. So you have to re-sign at the end of your first season for your next season. There are no benefit contributions under the micropod. There's no eligibility conferred under the micropod. You can't join the union as a result of having worked under a micropod contract. There's no reporting, which makes it really simple for podcasters who are just starting out. There's no payroll or timesheets or anything like that. And individuals engaging themselves who don't have a corporation or don't have an LLC, they are always going to be directed towards the micropod, regardless of their monetization. I want to stop for a second and make that really clear. If you are monetizing at a level that is over $10,000, but you don't have a corporation or an LLC, you're still going to be directed back to the micropod. That's going to be the right contract for you as an individual. This is a contract that's primarily for members who want to cover their own new projects, or they want to work with friends on creative, low-budget podcast projects. That's what it was really intended for. The submission process is through our portal. It's completely automated. You provide some information, you sign through the portal, everything happens there very quickly in just a few minutes, unless there's something in your answers that signals a need for a closer look. And at that point, we'll get in touch and say, hey, let's have a conversation. Make sure we understand what kind of a project you're creating here and that this is the right contract for you. Next slide. Our second podcast agreement is the independent podcast agreement, or the indie pod. What's covered by this contract are podcasts of any genre available on any podcast platform, those whose budget and or expected monetization in the aggregate for a podcast season exceed $10,000. So this includes the funding for your initial budget, as well as other sources of monetization. It includes Patreon and other patronage platforms, and advertising and subscriptions, and any way that you are monetizing can be included in that monetization. Those together, if they equal more than $10,000, this is a good option for you if you have a corporation or an LLC. You have to have a company to sign the independent podcast agreement. Under this agreement, benefit contributions are required at 20%. So you will be able to build towards your eligibility for health insurance, and also build your pension and build towards your eligibility for a pension credit by working under the independent podcast agreement. This agreement does confer eligibility. You can be eligible to join the union if you work under an indie pod contract. And the signatory, as I mentioned before, it always has to be a bona fide business entity. No individuals can sign the independent podcast agreement. Just like the micropod, it's a one production only, one pod, one season signing under the independent podcast agreement. For every new season, you come back and you re-sign, but it's a super simple process. The submission process is similar to the micropod. You go into the portal collects the necessary information for us to be sure that the independent podcast agreement is the right agreement for you. And then the dedicated staff guide producers through signing and give them dedicated podcast support docs, performer contract templates, a dedicated podcast cast list doc, a dedicated pension and health contribution doc. We're very supportive around signing the independent podcast agreement. It's super easy, but it's just a little bit more involved than the micropod. And under the independent podcast agreement, if you are employing yourself through your own corporation, through your own company, your project will be subject to a little bit of heightened review regarding verification of the income of the podcast and to make sure that appropriate contributions are paid into the pension and health plans. And one more time, this one's not for individuals. This one's just for companies. I should mention that the rates in both of these contracts are freely bargained. There are no minimum rates. Next slide. This is just a couple other things we want you to know about the agreements. In addition to the independent podcast agreement and the micropod agreement, we do have contracts with term signatories. These are podcast companies who sign an agreement with the union to do all of their podcasts under a union contract. And these contracts have minimums and are signed through the podcast department and our audiobook department. So you could, as a performer, be hired under one of these agreements, and it'll look a little bit different from the independent podcast agreement or the micropod because it's a negotiated agreement with a company that is a direct signatory. We allow limited video under the podcast agreements. For example, promotional behind the scenes footage for social media. We realize that social media is a visual medium and podcasts, of course, are audio content, and it's really hard to promote your podcast on social media if you don't have any video. So you are allowed to shoot video behind the scenes to help promote the podcast on social media. We also allow the videotaping of a podcast recording session, so long as there's no direction to perform for the camera, no additional footage is integrated into it, so long as it's just a recording session of the podcast being recorded. We permit that as well. And finally, and this is a super important piece, advertising. Coverage of your podcast under these new podcast agreements includes terms that allow for both host and performer read ads to be covered by a union contract without the need for an additional commercial signatory. So if a performer is recording their own podcast or has been hired to be in a podcast, either as a performer or a host, and they are recording ads for a brand or multiple brands to be exploited as part of that podcast, so long as the podcast is covered under a SAG-AFTRA agreement, the ads can also be covered. And the compensation for reading those ads is freely bargained separately from the compensation for hosting or performing in the podcast. It isn't necessary for an additional commercial signatory or signatories to be in place to cover each individual ad that might be recorded, which means that if the podcast is covered, the ads can be covered. And this is a really big deal. It's very important because Global Rule 1, of course, applies to commercials as well as podcasts. And then I have a bit of a side note. If you're a performer recording audio only ads that will be used in podcasts, but you're not the host and you're not a performer within the podcast, you're just recording ads completely separately that might be going into podcasts. Those kinds of advertisements have to be covered under the audio only commercials contract. That's the audio commercials contract. That is jurisdictional work, and an audio commercial signatory will need to be in place, and standard digital audio session and use rates will apply. So those are the two ways ads and podcasts can be covered. Next slide. This is what a producer or a podcaster producer will see when they go to our website, to the dedicated podcast page. That's on the left. There's the portal, side by side with what they will see when they click on the Sign Your Podcast button and start the process of signing their project through the portal. Next slide. Also on our dedicated webpage where the signing portal lives, you'll find these one-page informational docs, which include a lot of the information you've heard here today. They're downloadable if you want to share them with a podcasting friend. And they're clear and simple and sort of instructive. That webpage, again, is sagaftra.org/podcast contracts. But if there's something you need to know that isn't in there, if you have any questions or need assistance of any kind, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at podcastcontracts@sagaftra.org. We are standing by to help you and excited to do so. And now I will pass this back to Ben.
Right on. Sue-Ann, thank you so much for going through that. Very helpful, simple, shows people what we can do. Normally during this part of the PTEOE, we do a little Q&A, but I thought that today maybe we could have a little pod chat and talk to someone that helps execute these contracts, as well as a successful podcaster who is using the agreement for his own popular podcast. So with that, please welcome SAG-AFTRA Manager of Contract Strategic Initiatives, Shaine Griffin. Shaine comes to this work with a very real passion for how talent and advertisers are navigating new and emerging platforms. She has spent many years exploring how influencers and SAG-AFTRA intersect and was instrumental in the development of the influencer agreement, and now also manages the new podcast contracts. And we also have actor and podcaster Matt Marr with us today. Matt is the co-host of the popular Reality Gaze with Matty and Poodle podcast. Matt and Shaine, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us. So
yes,
exciting.
Thank you for having us.
And what a wonderful presentation, Sue-Ann. So Matt, I thought, you and I have had the opportunity to get to know each other in the last few months as you've, decided to sign your podcast under the independent podcast agreement. But for folks who may be watching, do you mind just introducing yourself and giving folks a better sense of who you are and how you've come to this point in your career?
I mean, girl, we've really gotten to know each other because I always ask you questions and you always answer. So I appreciate that.
My pleasure.
So I'm Matt Marr, and I'm a proud SAG member. I have been since I got in SAG through commercials because I'm a commercial actor. So I guess since 2010, 11. So a big hot minute. And so I've been doing that. And then I just, I've been podcasting now for, let's see, in 2014, I started an advice podcast because I'm one of those people that thought I was going to give up on acting. So I got my master's in psychology. So, and then literally someone said to me, you have a good face for commercials. And I got a commercial agent, and then I just started booking nationals like crazy, and I got back into acting. But I started this podcast called Dear Maddie, an advice podcast, in 2014. So I did that, and then Reality Gaze with my buddy Jake, or AKA Poodle. We started podcasting and kind of throwing things against the wall to see what would stick. We started that more in probably like 5-6 years ago, and then Reality Gaze kind of took hold about 3.5 years ago.
And it's exploded since, is my understanding.
We were one of those kind of COVID darling things where people were at home and they needed something to do, but also a lot of people just felt alone and felt isolated. And we are a show that we cover a lot of reality shows, but a lot of shows about dating. Like our main show is 90 Day Fiance, that's on TLC. And that's a huge, one of the most popular shows in cable, period. And Love is Blind and things like that. So and because there's so many shows, we are as Sue-Ann was talking about earlier, we are not a fictionalized podcast. We're more kind of like I would say almost, you could relate us to something like the Tonight Show or the Late Late Show. We're doing 4 or 5 podcasts a week, recapping, as we call, wonderful trash TV. And so we're kind of, I think we became companions for people in the middle of the pandemic who felt very alone and isolated. So it's been a wonderful feeling of creating and also helping people have a better life, which is that's the goal.
I love that so much. Matt, I'm curious, how did you hear about the new SAG-AFTRA podcast agreements?
Sugar, I listened to the podcast with Sue Ann. That's how I heard it. So it worked. It worked because I said, as a SAG member, I don't listen every week, but I subscribe to the podcast. And I forgot years ago, I think y'all were talking at the time about what the new commercials contract was going to be. And also what I've always told my fellow SAG members is just, or even non-SAG members, but just any actors or creators, I do a lot of audiobooks. I just learn more from listening than I do from watching and reading. So it's a great way if you take in information differently. And that's what I appreciate about what SAG is. It's giving us multiple information to digest this information.
I love that. Yeah, be sure, subscribe to the SAG-AFTRA YouTube channel right here. Subscribe to the podcast. Follow on social media, like and subscribe. Lots of different ways to get the information out there. And Matt, I love that because, I've tell members all the time, there's so many different ways. And it's been a personal passion of mine to make sure that as the union, we're getting information out in as many different ways as we can. And what a perfect example of how that can work. And that brought you here. So I'm just so delighted.
For
That's
sure.
awesome.
I think too, I think people get into, like, I remember, the SAG Awards were my favorite, but that and the Tonys were my favorite award shows as a kid. Like, so you dream about being a SAG actor. And I think a lot of times I feel like actors, sometimes they get into SAG and they're like, okay, well, that's it. I'm into SAG. But what I encourage people is, I get involved in the union. And so not only listen and read, but also give feedback, because I'll be honest, and I mean this in a good way. Like when we originally podcasts were being kind of lumped into the new media agreement, I was looking at things. I was like, this doesn't work for me. I'm not really an influence. It just didn't fit. So, and I know that the reason SAG said, okay, let's make something more specific. And also I cannot specify enough. So easier. Let's do something that's dedicated to podcast. And that's because you listen to podcasters that were either trying to work with the union or already in the union. So hats off to y'all. I appreciate that very much because it's such a weird little niche. Podcasting started we're this guerrilla style movement. We feel like we're putting a voice to voices that are not heard. It's such I started really because I was a gay podcaster and I didn't hear other gay voices. And so I think it's such an important place for marginalized voices, and y'all are doing such a good job of supporting that. I appreciate that.
We appreciate you. Matt, why did you decide? I mean, it hasn't been that long since we did the podcast. You got in touch right after, essentially. What was it that drove you to want to cover your podcast right away under a SAG-AFTRA contract? What was the thing that made you want to do it, or things? Real talk.
Because I like to talk about money and fight it, because I think a lot of people are vague about it. And they're like, and I want to be specific to help people. So I worked a day job in a law office for 18 years, being the actor in LA, doing my thing. They let me go in auditions and all that. And then our podcast, and I got health insurance through them. So I'd qualified for health insurance before as a commercial actor, but the law office gave me really good health insurance. So that's just kind of what I did. And my mother, who worked for the IRS years ago, was like, get your retirement and all that. And so I heard the podcast, and it was at the time, it was literally where I had quit my job of 18 years because podcasting had provided me this income that I was able to live my dream. And then I started paying personal insurance, and I'm paying $600 a month for terrible insurance. Like, I have like a heart thing, nothing bad, but I have to get checked on. And I just went and got an EKG, and they said, well, you have to pay $700 of this EKG. And I went, I'm already paying $600. So for me, and this is why I tell people this, because I think a lot of SAG actors don't realize, especially if you're already in SAG, you're a SAG actor, all these little avenues add up to your income that help you get benefits, that help you get amazing health insurance for a fraction of the cost. And my mother, my Oklahoma, Texas mama from IRS, who always says, you just need to get a pension. You need to get a pension. If you could have heard her drop the phone when I called her, I said, so Mom, I'm going to put money into my pension from my podcast. She screamed like I've never heard a woman scream on the phone. She was so excited.
That's fantastic.
I love that she was more excited about you working towards a pension, like I've been on TV, I've done commercials, millions of people. It's like, I put money into pension. Oh my God.
Yes.
You are successful. I love it.
She's like, you've made it, baby doll. You finally made it. I've been on national commercials with Justin Timberlake, all this, not that I'm putting money in my pension through my art.
Well, I love that because it's one of those things. I know when I first, moved to LA and was being an actor, it's the kind of thing that it's easy to not think about. And then like you, Matt, I was paying, I started companies, but I was paying privately for insurance. And I'm like, this is crazy. And I'm a healthy person, but one thing happens or need to get checked and it's like, I'm paying how much money?
Yes.
And
when
then,
you already pay so much money a month. Yes.
Crazy. So being able to have, some of those present, benefits that, are easy to take for granted, especially, early on in a career. And then you see and you go, oh gosh, all of a sudden that money comes out of your bank account and you go, okay, I can't afford headshots now because I just spent money on a medical thing that was preventing something to keep me healthy.
Yes.
So
don't get me started on that in America. Yeah. But yes, it's very.
We'll have another podcast about healthcare in America. Matt.
Go ahead,
please.
I was just going to say it's easier too because I think I was a great candidate because I've been a commercial actor, but I've also been a producer. I produced a short film years ago, and we wanted to use SAG because our script it was a movie short film about preteen kids, and we just wanted to make sure for me working at a law office for years, I was like, I don't want to do anything with children that's non-union. So we did that. I'm really glad we did. And it was a lot of work being a producer and a signatory and the paperwork I had to fill out. So that was I want to echo what Sue-Ann said, that I know somebody's listening to they're like, yeah, this woman Sue-Ann said it's easy. It's not going to be easy. Y'all, the paperwork is so much easier and so not what I expected. Like Shaine sent me the information and I kind of in my head said, okay, I need to take 2 hours to fill this out. This is going to take a long time. And so I finally I'd been putting it off and I finally sat down and did it. And it took me 15 minutes.
We are not paying Matt to say that.
No, you're not.
I'm not getting paid to be here. That is just from the trenches. The real and Matt, it goes to what you said. Look, as a member myself, I certainly work with staff a lot, and I love what you said earlier too, which is sharing feedback and saying, hey, this is what we need. And I think this is a great example, especially Shaine and Sue-Ann and lots of other people are like, hey, there's all these different avenues that our members are working now that's so different than even 5 years ago, but especially 10 years ago and beyond. But to me, this is a perfect example of the union being, easy to work with, but they can often only do things if they know what's going on. And so that feedback from us members is so helpful. I hear it from staff all the time. They go, look, we want to know what's going on because if we know, we can do something about it, whether it's creating a new contract or filing a claim or fixing an issue with the contract, but they can only help us if they know what's going on. And, there's so many thousands and thousands of, union jobs that are happening every day. The only way that they can help us is if they know something's going on. So what a great example. And you heard it all from Matt, who's not paid to be here. I'm not a member. 15 minutes. It's an easy process. You can do it for your podcast, makes it easy, allows you to work with and hire SAG-AFTRA members and health and pension opportunities, all of it. Amazing.
So with that, Matt, is there any advice or recommendations you'd give to other podcasters or folks who are interested in working in this space that you can send us off with?
I would say really, if you want to start a podcast, because people ask me all the time and then they hear how much work I put into it and their eyes kind of glaze over and they go, oh, it's not just turning on a mic and talking. It's not. You want to be intentional, but I also want to tell people that it's also, I think we see all the Instagram and TikToks and a lot of upper level podcasts look really slick and fancy. And they have, the video recordings and that's all great if you want to do that. But we're like one of the top podcasts in the world. And we still record out of my friend's living room with just 2 mics because that's the way we want to keep it. A police car drives by. And we tell people a running joke now on our podcast is don't pull over because our listeners were pulling over because they were driving, listening to our show, thinking a cop was stopping them. So we And I just want to tell people it's about the content, but more than how it looks, even how it sounds. So that's key. But also I feel like, I do I have a production partner that's in the PGA, and we pitch reality shows and non-scripted shows, and the filters of no or yes that we have to go through to get through these companies. And the reason why I started podcasting is I always say, I want to follow the fun. And I just wanted to create something as an artist in my living room that at least felt like, when you go on auditions, and we audition a lot and you don't get a role, you just want to feel like you're creating something and putting something out there. So for any actor or performer out there, I want to say podcast is such a wonderful, wonderful medium where you can create whatever you want. And I guarantee you, if you want to make a podcast about people that love knitting in the Northeast and have French bulldogs, you can make something that specific. And you might not have a million downloads, but you might have 2,000 people a month that really are impacted by your work. So I say, just grab the mic and start it.
I love that so much. Certainly resonates with me as a performer and a creative myself. And Matt, I think what a great example of taking your career and your artistry and your creativity and your storytelling into your own hands. I mean, literally, you're holding the mic. And I just think that's such a great example too of, the opportunities that we have, in the industry now. That haven't always existed. And, there used to be so many gatekeepers, and particularly you're talking about marginalized communities. Happy Pride Month. And, talking about like all these different ways that stories and storytellers who historically have been marginalized, like, hey, the access to get your story out there is available now. And Matt, you're a perfect example of clearly it's something that people want. I think the industry or the world, that's not what people want. Clearly they do. And I love that you've, found that audience and that the union's been able to support in making that possible. So thank you so much for being here and the work that you're doing with the community. And grab the mic and get started, everybody. Sue-Ann, Shaine, Matt, thanks for being here today. As a reminder to everyone watching, I also co-host a podcast with SAG-AFTRA National Executive Director and our Chief Negotiator, Duncan Crabtree Ireland. It's a great show. We've got episodes on a variety of topics, acting tips, contracts information, career advice. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the podcast apps. You can find it on SAG-AFTRA website if you want all the different links. And on behalf of the entire team here at SAG-AFTRA, thank you all so much for watching. And of course, a shout out to our regular viewers who've been tuning in each and every week for our educational live streams. If you have ideas for topics you want to see or hear us cover, send an email to pteoe@sagaftra.org. Thanks everybody so much, and we'll see you next time.